Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Everyone can hear me? I'm so excited to be here. It's great to see so many faces that I've known online for years that are actually here now. So, let's chat for a little while. In 2016, a combination of many coincidences made me move from a pretty safe career in Oslo to Dubai to start a company. And what was meant to be just a brief stay of maybe 1 year turned into actually 6 years living in the Middle East. So I started my consulting business working with some of Dubai's biggest tourist providers and helping them move their business online and become more data-driven. And Dubai was rich with people who built fantastic tourist experiences, but it was really hard to find good tech people there. It was a good, comfortable life, and I was actually quite content advising tourism companies, setting up marketing campaigns and helping them move online. But in 2017, something happened which changed my career. I can't quite remember how I stumbled upon it, but it was one of those offhand moments. I was searching for something that I knew for sure didn't exist, a full-stack platform that would help me build a fully functioning web application. And then there it was. That same day that I found Bubble, I decided to change my career overnight. I'd seen attempts at low-code and no-code ever since the 90s, but I'd never seen anything like this. The moment I tried saving something in the database and refreshing the page and see that it was still there, it was just a huge moment for me. This was how easily you could build an app. It all just clicked. For those of you who have read the Steve Jobs biography, you'll recognize a quote from Dr. Dre the first time he saw iTunes. From the beginning, I was struck by this very confusing thing, because here was this revolutionary product, and no one, literally no one, seemed to know about it. Not even Google, which is essentially the catalog of everything, knew about this. It was just a web page. There were no YouTube videos, there were no blogs, there were no tutorials, there were no Quora questions, there was nothing. There was just a website and a product unlike anything I'd ever seen. I soon discovered that Bubble was essentially two guys working out of cafes in New York, and I quickly became convinced that they were building the future of the internet. I obsessively wanted to learn everything there was to know about this platform. Overnight, I put all my eggs in the Bubble basket. Since then, I've created personal apps, I've created apps for clients, I've worked alone, I've worked in teams, and finally, after a few years, I felt confident enough in my skills to start teaching others how to use this platform. I started writing forum posts, I published hundreds of articles on my website, I started doing coaching sessions, I hosted boot camps, I wrote a book which led to another book, and then in 2022, Bubble approached me to rewrite their user manual, which is what I've been doing for the last 2 years. So from that weird coincidence 7 years ago of me Googling 100 times and finally stumbling into this website, here I am in New York and I get to speak to you guys. That's pretty awesome. And I have to say, I'm thrilled to be here. So huge thanks and shout out to Emmanuel and Josh, who actually bootstrapped this product for years before accepting any investor money and getting it just right before building a team around it. This weirdly named platform has already changed thousands of lives and will continue to do so. So, my name is Petter Amlie, that's Petter, and Amlie tends to cause a little bit of confusion, so I'll clear that up. It's Amlie. It's hard to believe that I've spent nearly 20 years now working with digital products in different forms, and the last 7 of those I've spent working with Bubble. But it has taught me a few tricks that I'd like to share with you today. I want to speak to you today about a perspective that has shaped how I think about app development. I divided this into 4 points. That's it. I'd like to convince you that features are like financial investments and what that means to your app, and how we can evaluate those investments and then look at real-world examples through that lens. So what do investors do? Well, they spend capital to buy assets, and those assets are expected to give them a return on that investment, right? It's pretty simple stuff when you boil it down. But just like financial assets have a cost, your app's features comes at the cost of development time and maybe extended deadlines, added complexity, and of course server resource usage, which we know as workload. What I'd like to see from any given feature is satisfied and engaged users, which can translate into providing value to your app in return, whatever that means to your app. So I'm here to talk about how to balance those investments. And specifically, I'd like to explore the connection between workload and user experience and discuss how you can design apps that are both useful and scalable. So first, can anyone tell me what this is? It's, of course, a trick question. This is a blank page, right? And this is the most workload-efficient app in the world. The only way you can get this to spend less workload is to have no app at all. And you may be thinking, now, that's very clever, Peter. Haha, very funny. Who would build an app like that? And of course, no one would. You would be completely meaningless and silly. But taking an idea to this extreme level can actually be pretty useful, because this tells us something. It tells us that if your goal is to simply minimize workload at all costs, this is what you'll be left with. So a ride to zero will give us all a bunch of blank pages. Now let's examine this a little bit closer. If we look at the activity table in the Bubble user manual, we can see that even loading a blank page consumes a little bit of resources. After all, a call has to be made to the server to load this useless page. And from that perspective, this is actually the most workload inefficient app in the world. It has a cost, but it provides absolutely no value. So even with a minimal cost, an investment is not worth it if it returns no value at all. Clearly, we can do better than this. Now, let's move away from Bubble for a little bit and visit the other extreme, spending massive amounts of server resources on a feature that returns so much value that millions of users are thirsting for it. Take companies like OpenAI. They've built models that generate text, images, audio, video, some of the most server-intensive features that you can imagine. They are pushing servers worldwide to the limit and above of what they're capable of. And we're still waiting for high-resolution, long-form video generation, because currently there's not enough server capacity in the world to roll out this one single feature, because it's so resource-intensive. While OpenAI is, of course, not a no-code product, it's not built on Bubble, the principle is the same. Generating text, audio, and video are really just incredibly complex workflows that spend resources like CPU, GPU, memory, hard drive space, and a bunch of other resources that are really costly to scale. And in this case, it actually can't be physically scaled fast enough in server parks. So the software has developed faster than the hardware in this case. And the reason I'm not currently following my dream of producing the next Hollywood blockbuster is that there's not even enough electricity in the world to power the servers needed to do that job. OpenAI have invented a feature that is so server-intensive that they have to sit on it and wait until the combination of software and hardware makes it launchable. So clearly, the willingness to invest incredible amounts of server resources that can potentially return a great ROI also comes with its own set of challenges, even if you're backed by Microsoft. And keep in mind, it's a problem of scale. It's not that servers can't produce one movie. It's that they can't produce the thousands of movies per second that the market wants. While we in Bubble Land are optimizing our app for workload, the people inside OpenAI and other companies are ripping their hair out trying to do the same thing. They're trying to reduce server resource consumption and find ways to produce more value with less resources. So we're all in the same high-tech boat. So let's look at that from the perspective of your Bubble app. First, let's clarify what workload means. So, as most of you know, workload is essentially a pricing metric, right? It tracks how much effort Bubble servers put into running your app. And Bubble commits to making the resources available to power your app as you scale without throttling or delays. And Bubble hosts more than 3 million apps now, actually 4 million we saw earlier. And they range from small to huge. And Workload helps Bubble balance the running and scaling of those apps while remaining profitable in the long term as a company and a platform provider. So when you scale, they scale. In OpenAI, they're tracking a gazillion different things to try to optimize their model to provide the highest quality output at the lowest possible resource consumption, whereas in Bubble, we have essentially boiled it into one. The metric itself can be connected to any specific process in your app, as you know, through the metrics dashboard to identify where exactly it is being spent. And this tells us something important. It tells us that some processes use more resources than others. And the way we stay on top of that is to use the metric dashboard to link any given workload consumption to a given process. So as techies, we're all doing the same thing. We're trying to shave off milliseconds of different processes to make things run faster and cheaper. But let's pause there for a little second and ask, why are milliseconds so important? Well, again, it's because of scale, because we have to multiply those milliseconds and the work the server does to power them by 10, 100, maybe 1,000, maybe even 1,000,000 users. So milliseconds become seconds, and seconds become minutes. And this is what scaling and workload is all about. Understanding the link between one process and how it multiplies with more users and repeated use. So that's workload. Sorry, a little bit fast here. That's workload. So now let's agree on a definition of what I mean by a feature. I'm not talking holistically about the features of your app, like Uber finding you a driver or Salesforce storing your customer information. These are kind of overarching features that are the result of 1,000 smaller decisions. Like in Uber's case, it's showing you a map, it's handling payments, it's implementing chats with drivers. These are the features I'm talking about. So these are the individual components of your app that make up your pages. And the information and elements that you decide to place on the screen, like search bars, lists, diagrams, charts, buttons, text, and maps, these are the features I'm talking about. Also, let's not mix the user perspective with the developer perspective, because database searches, actions, workflows, and conditions, these are not features, right? These are the tools that you use to build features. And they're part of your design decisions, but your users, they really don't care about them. They don't care about your database structure. They don't care how difficult it was to set up your API calls. They just want your app to solve a problem. And hiding how complex your app really is really an art form and a feature in itself. So we're looking at this literally through the eyes of the user. What do they see on screen, and how do those components behave? So when we look at features from a workload perspective, how do we know which features will consume a lot of resources and which won't? An investor buying an asset will look at different kinds of data to measure the health and worth of an asset, like looking at financial statement, market trends, risk factors. Similarly, what we will do is to examine specific metrics and characteristics to evaluate the cost of each feature that you're planning to implement. In the user manual, we've described 3 components, and each of them play a part of how you scale your app with workload in mind. So volume is literally the actual volume of data that your database returns from any query. For example, returning a list of numbers is less than returning a list of long blog posts. Complexity refers to server requests that are more complex than usual, that could maybe be made more efficient with an optimized expression or database structure. And typically the most complex queries come from a workload perspective are those that contain a kind of sub-query, where one query leads to another, maybe on each row of the actual results. And repetition, just like it sounds, is the frequency at which any operation occurs. And I'd like you to be especially mindful about this bottom point. Everything that you do in the first 2 will be multiplied by the last one. And even simple processes can make up a big portion of your total spending if it's repeated often enough, as we'll soon see. Okay, so with the metaphors and definitions and tools in place, let's look at what our options are for any given feature. It may seem on the surface that it's just a question of, do I want this feature here, or do I not want it? And a feature can be highly useful, or it can be highly wasteful. So for the features you're not sure about, should you just remove them? Luckily, it doesn't have to be that black and white. A feature can be highly useful, it can be highly wasteful, or it can simply be in the wrong place or presented at the wrong time. And this last point is often overlooked in my experience. So if we translate this into actions, you can decide to build or keep a feature. You can decide to remove it altogether or not build it. You could optimize it in different ways, or you could decide to simply move it to a different place. So let's look at what I mean with that with a short story. So my sister works in the quality assurance and certifications industry, which means that her employer ensures that industrial processes, stuff like ships and elevators and all of that, is meeting safety and quality standards, and they issue certifications to comply with that. When she logs onto her company network in the morning, she's greeted by something like this. At first glance, this seems really useful. It provides a lot of information in one place, and it gives an overview of how her company is performing, which sounds great, right? Let's consider it from her perspective. What is it that she actually needs at 8 a.m. on a Monday when she logs on? Well, not this, as it turns out. What she really needs is something like this: quick access to her inbox to see the incoming projects that arrived over the weekend from different time zones. So what does that mean from the perspective of an investor? Dashboards like this are typically very server intensive. This dashboard isn't just crunching one number, it's aggregating a lot of data points from across the company. The server is working really hard to pull all this information together. So let's look at this like an investor would. On the cost side, we have development time, which is about medium. If you have your database structure correctly set up, it shouldn't be too much of a job. Complexity for the developer is also, I'd say, around medium. It requires knowledge on database structure, efficient queries, and aggregation, but it's not overly complicated. On the workload side, it's fairly heavy. Like we talked about, this is happening on every page load, and it's already a pretty heavy process that we're repeating a lot. So right now, the balance may lean a little bit heavier on the cost side, but you have an interesting thing going on the right side. We have high satisfaction, but we have low engagement. And what does that mean in this case? In this case, it means that we have a very useful feature, but it's not used as frequently as we thought it would. Does everyone need to see this dashboard on page load? For my sister, the answer is no. The workload consumed to generate this dashboard could be better spent elsewhere, like delivering the information that she actually needs to start her day, which is her inbox. Not only does this improve the app from her perspective, but it also significantly reduces workload consumption. So we're lowering the cost and we're getting a better product from it. That sounds like a no-brainer to me. And this example with high usefulness and low frequency highlights something interesting. We need to think situationally about our design. Not only is this feature useful, but when is it useful? So what can we do in a situation like this? When we evaluated the feature, which in case is already built, we determined that it was actually highly useful, just not every time the page loads. So what we can do in this case is to move it. We could set up a simpler page that requires minimal workload and gives the user a choice to see the dashboard or the inbox. We could also set up our app to allow users to pick which screen to show first and just save it on the user type. That way, the app would load the data that is most important to each individual user instead of loading the full dashboard every time. So it's a situational investment, right? Think about it this way. You may have invested in an expensive suit or a fancy dress for a wedding or an important business meeting, but you wouldn't wear those clothes to go running in Central Park with high heels and polished shoes. It's a situational investment, right? You keep it in your closet and you bring it out when it's appropriate, when the situation calls for it. For some, it's daily. For others, a few times per year. So we can do the same thing about a feature. We can put it in the closet and let our users pull it out when it's needed. Another way we can think situationally and optimize our dashboard is to avoid showing everything at once. Charts, lists, diagrams, these can all be expandable sections that are not showing by default. Setting it up like this, we can avoid loading the data until the user actually asks for it and needs it. Again, things don't need to be black and white. By selectively hiding and showing parts of the page, we can reduce the total load on page load. And we're not in a race towards zero. Remember, we're not building the blank page. We're trying to make good investments in features that are available when our users need them. So let's look at another example, this time using workflows. Here's a video course app. It shows short lessons uploaded by sellers in a marketplace. It has all the usual components of a video course app. It has a list of lessons, the video itself, some text descriptions, and there are different UX choices we could look into to reduce workload here, but let's now just assume that we're happy with this design. This is how we want it to work. And this platform has a clever feature that saves the user's progress every second, so that if they close or refresh the window, they'll immediately be taken back to where they were in the video. The workflow itself looks like something like this. Do every X seconds, you all know this event. Make changes to a thing, we save the progress in seconds, and it's all done. It's a very handy feature. It's a solid investment in user experience. But let's take a critical look at it. On the cost side, this is a pretty low development time. It's a simple workflow. Its complexity is very low. Its workload consumption is potentially very heavy. And why is that for such a simple workflow? Well, it runs every second. right? One user means that we will be making one database query every second. And of course, if you reach 100 users, 1,000 users, 100,000 users, that means you're sending 100,000 requests to the Bubble server every second that they have their app open. And this is where the milliseconds of server work starts to matter. This is a very lightweight operation, but since we are multiplying it by the thousands and the millions, it turns into minutes and hours of work for the server. So we're asking Bubble to write to the database potentially thousands of times per second. But again, we're in a situation where the answer doesn't have to be black and white. We don't have to remove it altogether. We could do that, of course, which means the video will start playing from the beginning every time it's loaded. For some apps, that could be just fine. However, there's another solution staring us in the face here. We could get the video to return to the exact second where the user left off. But how unhappy would our users be if we make that convenience just slightly less precise? Let's say we save this information once every 3 seconds instead. Keep in mind, that frequency doesn't mean that it will always be 3 seconds off. It means it will be maximum 3 seconds off, right? We have reduced the workload consumption of that single process by 67% just by making a very simple decision. Let's make that 5 seconds. That means we have an 80% reduction in what could potentially be one of the heaviest processes in your app. That's a huge improvement coming from a very small decision, barely noticeable for most users. So what we did here was not to remove anything or drastically change anything. We just looked at the cost of the investment versus the benefit, and we realized we could actually drastically reduce the cost with only a slight reduction in user satisfaction, maybe none. We're essentially getting the same ROI, but with a lower cost. Let's have a look at another one. So in this same video course platform, someone thought of adding a note-taking feature. The idea was that keeping notes inside the app could add nice details like linking a note to a specific lessons or even linking it to a specific timestamp. It's not a bad idea, but the client wanted this feature to be in place by launch, and we paused. We asked them to reconsider whether this was a good investment at launch. So let's have a look at that. In this case, we'd be looking at something like a medium development time. It's not huge. It takes some time to set up, but it wouldn't take weeks. The complexity is pretty low, and in this case, so is the workload. We're creating and changing notes every now and then. Unless users are obsessively adding notes, it shouldn't be too bad. But then let's look at the ROI side. In this case, we actually talk to users and we research how they would use the app. And it turns out, like we saw in the lesson from the dashboard, that it's a nice feature, but it's actually not very much used. It turns out people have their own ways of taking and organizing notes. A surprising amount of people still use pen and paper and prefer handwritten notes. Many use an iPad or Remarkable and they save their handwritten notes on them. Or people use Apple Notes or Google Keep to keep their notes on the same screen as they watch the content. It turned out not very many people wanted to use this feature at all. So no matter the method, it turned out that users were indirectly saying that the feature did not provide that much value to the app. They preferred to take notes in their own way. Now, this doesn't mean you should never build a note-taking feature, right? That's not the lesson here. The lesson is that the feature does require making an investment, and you should be getting a return on that investment if you want to include the feature. Some features are not worth investing in. Going back to our Shakespearean existential question on whether to feature or not to feature, in this case, we decided not to feature at all. The feature was never built, spending no resources in development or use. We could have invested at a fairly low cost, but the ROI simply wasn't enticing enough. Okay, so let's go over what we've covered here. Features are like financial investments, weighing the development time, complexity, and server resources they require against their potential to provide value in return. Features that are high cost but low value may not be worth building or even keeping around, like we saw with the note-taking feature. Decisions are not black and white, but can be situational, like we saw with the example on the dashboard. Selectively showing features and allowing the user to pick which features to show can actually improve the user experience while reducing workload, so it's a win-win situation. And to round that off, an app that tries to do everything, as awesome as it sounds, is rarely successful, but an app that does the right thing, those are the ones that users tend to like. Thank you very much for your time.